for a while. Senator Simons.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I rise today to speak to Bill C-12, an act respecting certain measures relating to the security of Canada's borders and the integrity of the Canadian immigration system and respecting other security measures. Now, when we read the titles of these bills, the word respecting isn't used in the Aretha Franklin R-E-S-P-E-C-T sort of way. No, the word respecting here has a more archaic meaning, a sense of being relating to or in regards to. And the irony is bleak, because Bill C-12 isn't about respecting the integrity of Canada's immigration system. It is about undermining it, about allowing our immigration and refugee system, long admired as one of the best in the world, to be undermined in a vain effort to appease the anti-immigrant backlash within our own country, and to appease a former friend and ally who is now all too keen to find excuses to trespass on our national sovereignty. Well, maybe that seems melodramatic.
Wow, good.
And I would agree if you only looked at the parts of the bill that deal with matters such as money laundering, drug smuggling, and stolen cars. But nestled in the middle of a bill about making Canada and Canadians safer is a section that makes us all a little less safe. Under the terms of this proposed legislation, asylum seekers are ineligible if they make their refugee claims more than 12 months after landing in Canada. The rules are even stricter for those who cross a land border between ports of entry. They have only 2 weeks to file their papers. Those timelines simply aren't reasonable for all claimants and could lead to some of the most vulnerable refugees being deported back to danger. As the Canadian Council for Refugees puts it, quote, "The provisions will particularly endanger survivors of gender-based violence, LGBTQIA+ individuals, unaccompanied minors, individuals with mental health issues, and people whose countries are facing political unrest," end quote. Claimants deemed ineligible because of these rules may be offered what is called a pre-removal risk assessment to ensure that they are not sent back to situations where they could face persecution and even death. But such an in-house risk assessment is no substitute for an oral hearing carried out by an independent tribunal. And according again to the Canadian Council for Refugees, immigration officials simply do not have, quote, "the independence nor the expertise to assess the merits of a claim." The UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, has also implored our government to add a mandatory hearing process to ensure an individual's right to be heard, as well as a right of a full appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division of the Immigration and Refugee Board. The UNHCR is also asking for a process which would allow asylum seekers a stay of removal until their appeal is heard. Senator Dean spoke about the third country agreement, the third safe country agreement. What is that agreement worth when every night on our television screens and our phones we see evidence that that third country is no longer safe for thousands and thousands of claimants? Senator Dean has spoken of the extreme backlogs in our refugee acceptance system. And they do seem extreme, unfair, Kafkaesque, I'm sure, to people caught up in that system. But is the answer to move the goalposts or to add more resources so that people with legitimate reasons to seek asylum in Canada can be properly heard? But perhaps the most disturbing section of Bill C-12 is Part 7, Section 87.301.1, which allows the Governor and Council to, quote, "cancel or vary documents, including permanent resident visas, permanent resident cards, temporary resident visas, electronic travel authorizations, temporary resident permits, work permits, or study permits," end quote. Let it be clear, the Governor and Council requires no objective evidence or criteria to cancel visas en masse, but need only hold the opinion that it is in the public interest to do so. On that wholly subjective basis, a government could simply cancel permanent resident visas and cards, suddenly turning people who are legal, settled immigrants to Canada into people without papers and without recourse, since there are no grounds for appeal. The same fate could be meted out to international students who have been granted visas and are studying in the country legally, or to temporary foreign workers who have broken no rules. And we're not talking about people having their papers canceled on a case-by-case basis because of something they've done wrong, even an allegation of something they've done wrong, but about whole categories and classes of people having their right to live or work or study in Canada taken away holus bolus. Senator Dean has assured us that just because you lose your card or your papers doesn't necessarily mean a loss of status. I can only tell you that immigration and refugee groups with whom I've consulted and whose briefs I have read see things rather differently. Let me tell you what Amnesty International said about Section 7. Quote, "Such powers could be used in arbitrary, politically motivated, and discriminatory ways. They would also create profound insecurity for people who have established their lives in Canada and for those seeking to reunite with loved ones," end quote. The Migrant Rights Network says this. It says, quote, "Its gravest concern is Part 7, which would grant sweeping authority to the Governor and Council to cancel, suspend, or modify immigration documents and applications en masse in the public interest. This would deny people the right to individualized assessment and due process. Furthermore, the public interest is intentionally not defined to allow maximum flexibility. This risks Part 7 being used in politically motivated and discriminatory ways on the bases of country of origin, language, socioeconomic status, and other grounds protected under the Charter," end quote. The network adds, quote, "Part 7 would open the doors to discrimination permanently for all future governments. For those of us living and working in Canada without citizenship, Part 7 means our lives can be upended at any moment based on who we are, not what we've done," end quote. One of the sad things about this entire process, of course, is that very few of these groups were allowed to be heard in testimony in the other place. One of the things we must assure is that we in this chamber hear from these voices and from these experts, that they be allowed to testify and share their legal and personal expertise. Because when we look at Part 7 and compare it to what is happening in the United States, we can see the Trump regime using a remarkably similar tactic to void the visas of Haitian refugees who had been granted temporary protected status in the United States. Now, it may be hard for us when we look at the globally respected Mark Carney government and at Minister Ananda Sangari, himself an immigrant and a respected human rights lawyer, to imagine that they would have any nefarious intentions. But this legislation isn't being drafted just for their use. It would remain on the book for years after. And it isn't hard, is it, to imagine a different sort of government in a different sort of time weaponizing such legislation in a very similar way to what we see south of us. Such policies are not only potentially unfair to immigrants, international students, and foreign workers, they have the potential to backfire spectacularly on every Canadian. What heart surgeon, what AI engineer, what nurse, what entrepreneur, what academic is going to want to uproot their families and start a new life in Canada, knowing that their permanent residency could be revoked so arbitrarily? What brilliant grad student is going to opt to take up a fellowship here, knowing that their student visa could be ripped up if they happen to belong to the wrong group at the wrong time? What temporary foreign worker or live-in domestic caregiver is going to take that gamble? So why do we suppose that our government, our Canadian government, is pushing through such changes at this moment in our history? And perhaps I can only answer from my perspective as an Albertan. In my own beloved multicultural province, the province that literally invented the political idea of official multiculturalism, a small group of malign but very loud political actors are weaponizing xenophobia. That's the polite Greek term for racism, in an effort to divide the province and split our country. At town halls across the province for the last few months, there's been talk not just of drastically cutting immigration levels to Alberta, but of mass deportations and what is now called remigration. That's a polite word for Judenhaus. Premier Danielle Smith has said publicly that if she got her wish and had more control over Alberta's immigration policy, new immigrants and refugees would be denied access to public health care and public schools. Until somebody becomes a permanent resident and citizen, we'll treat them like tourists, she recently told Calgary Herald columnist Rick Bell. Quote, as a tourist, you don't go to somebody else's country and expect to get child care and education and health care and other benefits, end quote. As the daughter of a refugee and as the granddaughter of immigrants, this kind of rhetoric hits me at a gut level. At this moment in world history, as we see the brown shirts of ICE trampling human rights in Minneapolis, as we see forces of division sowing anti-immigrant sentiment across Canada and around the world, this country and this chamber need to stand against the darkness. But this isn't just a matter of human rights and human dignity. Given the demographics of our country, we need immigrants and refugees to build our future. Population growth here hasn't just hit zero. Canada's population is literally dropping, and the economic and social consequences will affect us all. However much we cut immigration levels, however much harder we make it to file a refugee claim, the haters, within Canada and without, will never be satisfied. Let us stop eroding our sovereign, proud immigration system in some misguided effort to appease MAGA and Maple MAGA. We need an immigration system that works for Canada's economy, for Canada's community, and for Canada's moral integrity and international reputation. Let me end with this analysis of Bill C-12 from the Canadian Bar Association. They said, quote, the bill contains flaws that open it to constitutional challenge, and the solutions proposed run a serious risk of exacerbating rather than alleviating existing problems in the immigration field, meanwhile undermining Canada's commitment to protecting refugees and eroding the checks and balances that are fundamental to our parliamentary democracy, end quote. My friends and colleagues, it is now up to us as senators to be the check and balance that this legislation requires and to be allowed to perform our fundamental role in our parliamentary democracy. Thank you, merci, and hi-hi.
Senator Wu.
Well, my seat may take a question.
We look like a teeter-totter, but yes, I would be delighted.
Senator Wu.
I'm so lucky to be sitting to such distinguished colleagues and excellent orators. I want to thank Senator Simons for her impassioned speech and a reminder that this is not the chamber of the 51st state and that we should not be passing legislation that mimics the idea of the 51st state. Senator Simons, you know, one of the predictable consequences of this bill, which would have the power to summarily cancel or suspend applications and make potential immigrants vulnerable, is that they will go underground. They will go into hiding. And I'm told that the numbers that might go into hiding run into the hundreds of thousands. I don't know if this is true. This is something that our committee can perhaps look into. If in fact hundreds of thousands of residents already here go into hiding because they fear being deported, what do you think is going to happen with CBSA and the authorities and the powers that might be given to them to ferret them out, to ferret out the people in hiding and get them out of the country? Are we looking at a scenario that, dare I say, further mimics the United States?
Senator Simons.
Without the capacity to prognosticate, I can only say that every time I look at the footage from Minneapolis, a city that looks so much like my Edmonton, I can't help but imagine what it would mean to have something like that happening here. But I think you raise a point that has other complexities. If we drive people underground, we create a shadow population like they have in the United States. Those are people who are not going to have access to health care, who are not going to be able to send their children to school, who are not going to be able to work legally, who are not going to be able to pay taxes. It doesn't make any sense to drive people underground when we want to welcome them, settle them here, ensure that they are integrated into our communities, integrated into our economies. It's a waste of human capital, if I can put it in that kind of pragmatic, utilitarian sense. But it also does, as you say, create this cycle of fear. where now people are afraid of what they don't see and what they don't know, and that does give license to the potential for law enforcement overreach.